Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books in Bytes.
Great to be here.
Today we're taking a deep dive into Jagdish Bhagwati's influential book, In Defense of Globalization.
Yeah, published back in 2004, but still incredibly relevant.
Absolutely. Bhagwati really makes a strong case here. He argues that economic globalization, the kind driven by trade and foreign direct investment, is fundamentally a benign force.
And crucially, that it has a human face. He's directly challenging a lot of the criticism that was, and still is, leveled against it regarding negative social impacts.
Exactly. So in our discussion today, we'll explore the book's core arguments. We'll look at the anti-globalization movement, what drives it.
Right, and then examine the actual impact on things like poverty, gender issues, child labor.
We'll also consider the role of NGOs, which Bhagwati discusses quite a bit.
And effects on culture, labor standards, even democracy.
And finally, touch on how you actually manage this whole interconnected system. We'll try to move through these themes more or less as they appear in the book.
Sounds good. And what's interesting right off the bat is how Bhagwati approaches the anti-globalization movement. He doesn't just dismiss it, does he?
No, not at all. He starts by trying to understand it, acknowledging that many critics are driven by genuine concerns about poverty, the environment, social ills. It's not just knee-jerk opposition for many.
Right, which leads into one of his first big points, what he terms the gigantic non sequitur.
Yeah, unpack that for us.
Well, the idea is that many of the social problems that anti-globalists point to poverty and environmental damage aren't actually caused by globalization.
He argues the opposite, often, that globalization can actually help fix them.
Exactly. It's a fundamental misattribution in his view. He also spends some time looking at the rise of NGOs, non-governmental organizations.
Groups like 50 Years is Enough, Global Exchange, they became very visible.
Very visible. And Bhagwati notes their role, but cautions against sort of broad condemnations of globalization based on their protests. He thinks we need to address the specific criticisms they raise.
Rather than throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak.
Precisely. He talks about the protests sometimes being like guerrilla tactics, good for getting media attention, maybe, but potentially distracting from the deeper issues.
So his book aims to get past the spectacle.
Yeah, to really engage with the substance. He lays out his goals clearly. Understand the anti-globalization sentiment, challenge the idea that globalization lacks a human face, show its actual human face, the positive impacts, and then think about governance.
Okay, and he quickly gets into what he calls the fallacies of aggregation. What's that about?
It's this idea that you can't just link all aspects of globalization together.
Yeah.
Just because someone supports, say, free trade in goods.
Doesn't mean they automatically have to support totally free movement of capital or unrestricted immigration, for instance.
Exactly. He uses Ralph Nader as an example of someone who, he feels, conflates these different things.
And Bhagwati himself has a history here, right?
Yeah.
He mentions being seen as a bit of a heretic for warning about unfettered capital flows, even while championing free trade.
He does. He draws a clear line between the two. He contrasts these fearful views, the malign impact idea, with the more standard economist's view, which tends to see a benign impact, generally positive outcomes.
Even if the motives aren't always purely altruistic.
Right. Intentions versus outcomes.
So how does he see attitudes changing, particularly in developing nations?
He highlights quite a significant shift in the South, as he calls it, countries moving towards embracing globalization more. He points to Brazil under Cardoso as an example.
A country that previously had strong concerns about dependency, right?
Exactly. That shift, he argues, comes from seeing the failures of inward-looking policies and the successes, particularly in East Asia, of countries that opened up.
And technology plays a role too, doesn't it? He mentions things like the telegraph.
Oh, absolutely. He sees technological leaps in communication and transport as historically crucial drivers of integration. You can't separate the technology from the process.
But he's not naive about the downsides either. He acknowledges risks, especially for producers in poorer countries shifting to global markets.
Yeah, like farmers switching to export crops. They become much more vulnerable to global price swings or new competitors.
Which points to the need for, what? Better support systems?
Stronger institutions, yes. Safety nets, ways to manage that volatility. He also pushes back against the idea that today's globalization is just more of the same. He thinks it has unique features and generates new anxieties we need to address specifically.
What are those main anxieties, according to him?
He groups them into a sort of trilogy of discontents. anti-capitalism, anti-Americanism, and then the specific concerns of groups like labor and environmentalists.
Anti-capitalism is interesting. After the Cold War, it seemed capitalism had won, but
But the sentiment persists, he notes, especially among younger generations, perhaps seeing it as failing on social justice issues. He contrasts this with the past appeal of the Soviet model, even to some intellectuals.
he also touches on the power of language, how terms like fair trade get used.
Uh-huh. How language frames the debate. Sometimes, he suggests, rebranding protectionism. He connects this back to historical Marxist ideas of globalization as exploitation.
And even digs into historical views on things like usury lending at interest.
Yeah, showing these moral debates about markets aren't entirely new. They evolve.
What about immigration in this anti-globalization context?
He sees different takes on the right and left. Often, anti-globalization on the right extends to anti-immigration. The left, he suggests, is often more benignly neglectful, though with rare exceptions actively supporting free movement.
He also brings up the communitarian critique, the idea that not everything should be a commodity.
Right, like debates over pollution permits or, say, selling parking spaces for people with disabilities. It highlights the limits of pure market efficiency arguments. There are other values at play.
So wrapping up this first part, it's a diverse movement with complex motivations.
Definitely. And Bhagwati's point is we need to engage with those concerns seriously, not just dismiss the motley crew, as he puts it.
Okay, so then he shifts gears in the next part, arguing that globalization is actually socially beneficial, not just economically.
Yes, but with an important caveat right away. Speed matters.
Ah, the optimal versus maximal speed idea.
Exactly. He uses Russia's shock therapy, rapid wholesale liberalization as a cautionary tale. Too much, too fast can be destabilizing.
That makes intuitive sense. He also reminds us that most NGOs aren't actually focused on the global economy, right?
Right. The vast majority are dealing with all sorts of other social issues from, local health initiatives to human rights advocacy.
And even among the ones focused on globalization, there's diversity.
Absolutely. He mentions groups from think tanks like the Economic Policy Institute to environmental groups like the Sierra Club, and importantly, organizations from developing countries themselves, like the Third World Network, different perspectives.
He makes an interesting observation about social activism in India, too.
Yeah, the feminization of it, as he puts it. The growing prominence of women leaders in NGOs, citing Vandana Shiva. He even includes a slightly humorous anecdote about NGO work becoming socially desirable.
And in Eastern Europe, post-communism.
He talks about the rise of civil society there, often driven by intellectuals emphasizing morality and action outside state structures, hovels anti-politics. But he notes the challenge of translating that into effective democratic governance later on.
But he also flags a concern about misinformation.
Yes, he gives the example of claims about child labor in Ivory Coast cocoa plantations, suggesting some anti-globalization groups exaggerated this situation compared to what surveys found. It's a warning about checking facts.
Okay, this brings us squarely to poverty. This is a huge theme for him.
Absolute central. His core argument is that globalization, particularly through trade and investment, is a powerful engine for poverty reduction.
He draws on examples from Asia.
Yes, firsthand accounts and observations. He paints this picture of like a chicken farm thriving next to a new microelectronics factory in Thailand, tangible signs of progress linked to global integration.
But it's not automatic, is it? Growth alone isn't enough.
No, that's crucial. He stresses the need for the right policies to ensure the poor can actually connect to these new opportunities. Growth might happen, but if certain groups say in remote tribal areas or inner cities are cut off, it won't help them.
So policies that enable access, like access to investment.
Right. He argues that shifting from bureaucratic controls to market mechanisms can actually be more egalitarian, letting more people participate. He cites Sir Arthur Lewis about needing to be in front of the counter.
He also looks back historically at protectionism, the idea of using tariffs to shield infant industries.
He does, using the example of the McKinley tariff on tin plate in the U.S. But he argues the overwhelming modern evidence from major studies by the OECD and NBER in the 60s and 70s points against inward-looking strategies for development.
So the evidence favors openness.
Strongly favors openness or outward orientation. He contrasts India's more autarkic path for many decades with the export-led growth of the East Asian economies during the same period.
And the difference in outcomes was stark.
Huge differences in export growth, income growth, and poverty reduction. He attributes the East Asian miracle largely to high rates of productive investment, unlike, say, the often unproductive investment in the old Soviet bloc.
So his bottom line on poverty is pretty clear.
Very clear. Globalization helps reduce poverty in poor countries. It doesn't cause it or worsen it
Yeah.
based on the empirical evidence he presents.
What about inequality, though? That's often linked with poverty in these debates.
He acknowledges they're distinct, but related. High inequality can feel much worse when there's also widespread poverty. He uses India and Russia as examples where this tension is palpable.
But does he think globalization causes greater inequality?
He argues the evidence doesn't support the claim that globalization has broadly increased poverty or significantly widened global inequality between nations. If anything, he suggests, the trends might point the other way.
Okay. Now, child labor. A very emotive issue.
Deeply concerning, yes. He cites the scale of the problem, mostly in poor countries. But again, he challenges the idea that globalization makes it worse.
He has evidence suggesting the opposite.
He presents econometric evidence from Vietnam in the 1990s. When restrictions on rice exports were eased, rice prices went up.
Go.
And this increase in income for rice farming families was linked to a reduction in child labor. The economic opportunity made it less necessary for children to work.
Interesting. So economic improvement through trade helped reduce child labor in that case.
That's the argument, yes.
Let's turn to women. How does Bhagwati see globalization impacting women?
It's a nuanced picture. He shares an observation about Japan, where he saw corporate expansion and more people studying abroad, contributing to shifting attitudes about women's roles.
And economically. Does trade help or hurt women?
He argues that increased competition from trade can actually reduce gender prejudice in hiring. Firms that discriminate pay a price for it. They miss out on talent, so competition pushes them towards merit.
What about some of the critiques, like the idea of global care chains?
He's a bit skeptical there. He questions applying Western family models universally and argues things like child care support are really domestic policy issues, not reasons to attack the WTO.
But he does acknowledge specific concerns, like safety for women workers.
Oh, yes, particularly women working in export processing zones, EPZs, maybe commuting long distances. He puts the responsibility on firms and host governments to ensure security.
And he doesn't shy away from the darker side, things like trafficking.
No, he acknowledges historical and current problems, violence, abuse of migrant workers, trafficking linked sometimes to tourism or migration flows facilitated by globalization. His point is, these need specific international and domestic action. They are terrible downsides, but not inherent to globalization itself, which he still sees as broadly benign.
Okay, let's move to democracy. Does globalization help or hinder it?
He says it's complex, no easy answer. He does acknowledge that globalization, especially economic integration, can constrain a nation's policy options. Think Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice the Duke can't just ignore trade rules because Antonio was popular.
Right, there are external pressures.
But he outlines the common two-step argument often made for globalization, promoting democracy. Step 1. Globalization brings prosperity.
Which he argued for earlier regarding poverty reduction.
Exactly. Step 2. Prosperity leads to a bigger middle class, which then demands more democratic rights.
And politicians seem to believe this.
He cites figures like Tom DeLay, Clinton, Bush, talking about China joining the WTO, expecting it to foster a democratic middle class over time. Whether that's happening is another debate, but the belief was there.
Does he see any risks to democracy from globalization?
He considers the worry, perhaps more relevant in the past, that a country trying a very radical left-wing path might face capital flight and economic crisis in a globalized world, a kind of external discipline.
And what about trade policy itself? Is it democratically decided?
He argues against the idea that governments don't really win or lose elections on trade issues. He points to the history of multilateral trade rounds as a series of decisions made through political processes that gradually lowered barriers.
And the institutions like the WTO.
He briefly touches on how decisions are made there, negotiation, the role of the Secretariat, dispute settlement, different facets of governance.
Okay, next up, culture. The coca-colonization fear.
Yeah, the concern that globalization swamps local cultures. He acknowledges this is a real anxiety, pointing to meetings hosted by countries like France or Mexico specifically about protecting cultural identity. He even mentions the Canadian quip about Sheila's cops, referring to cultural content rules.
And the dominance of English.
He sees that partly as a legacy of historical power trade following the flag, military dominance, and American culture's continued influence today.
But does he think local cultures just disappear?
Not necessarily. He points to how global brands often adapt. McDonald's isn't exactly the same everywhere. They adjust menus in Paris or Beijing.
Adaptation, not just replacement.
Right. He also makes the interesting point that globalization can sometimes amplify the voices of marginalized local groups, like indigenous communities protesting a dam project, giving them an international platform.
What about government action to protect culture?
He discusses examples like France taxing cinema tickets to fund French films. He seems to think governments have a right to pursue cultural policies, even recounting his own satirical pushback against Hollywood lobbying during trade talks.
And the U.S. role?
He sees the U.S. as a major net exporter of culture due to its dynamism and, well, its global influence. This inevitably leads to a spread of its cultural products and values.
Is there a tension between high and low culture here?
Yes, he touches on that. The spread of popular culture can clash with traditional ways, creating intergenerational conflict. And certain values associated with, say, American culture like women's rights can be seen as threatening by more traditional regimes.
Okay, let's talk wages and labor standards, another core area of concern.
Definitely. He starts by noting Marx's prediction about workers getting poorer under capitalism didn't really pan out in the long run, partly due to social legislation like factory acts.
But the fears resurface, right, like with NAFTA in the U.S.
Exactly. Concerns that competition from low-wage countries will drive down wages and standards at home. Echoes of historical debates.
How does he counter the race to the bottom argument?
He uses this idea of ladders of comparative advantage. As poorer countries like China start exporting simple manufactured goods, countries that were doing that before, like South Korea or Taiwan, move up the ladder to more complex products.
So it's not an endless pileup at the bottom.
That's the idea. It's a dynamic process. He also challenges the empirical basis for the race to the bottom in labor standards, suggesting examples like California's environmental rules show that higher standards don't automatically kill competitiveness.
He also points to domestic factors affecting labor.
Yeah, like U.S. labor law, the Taft-Hartley Act, influencing union strength, separate from globalization pressures. And he adds a note of cynicism, suggesting sometimes calls for high labor standards abroad can be a disguised form of protectionism.
Okay, environment next. Similar concerns about a race to the bottom.
Similar concerns, yes. He starts by contrasting historical views of nature, basically, they're for human use, with modern environmentalism's focus on nature's intrinsic value.
Does trade automatically hurt the environment?
He argues no. Increased wealth from trade can actually fund better environmental protection. Growth and environmental improvement can go together, even if policies aren't perfect. He even argues some protectionist measures can be environmentally damaging.
Like quotas on fuel-efficient small cars leading to more imports of bigger ones.
Exactly. His point is about finding the right balance, appropriate environmental policies that reflect how a society values environmental protection relative to income gains.
But he acknowledges real problems, like deforestation linked to global demand.
Oh, yes. He doesn't dismiss the concerns, but he argues against putting sort of infinite value on saving every single tree. It's about realistic valuation and raising the relative value placed on the environment as societies get richer.
He distinguishes between local and global pollution.
Yes. Global problems, like climate change, require international cooperation. Domestic pollution is primarily a matter for national democracy, like the debate over drilling in Alaska.
And the evidence for a race to the bottom in environmental standards.
He argues it's weak empirically. Again, citing examples like California and econometric studies. He even suggests multinationals might sometimes bring higher standards or push for greener technologies.
What about trade rules and environmental regulations, like the EU ban on hormone-treated beef?
He discusses how the WTO system handles this, generally requiring scientific evidence for health and safety regulations to prevent them being used as disguised trade barriers.
And the issue of process and production methods, or PPMs, like banning goods made with child labor or tuna caught without dolphin-safe nets.
He sees dangers there if trade restrictions are based purely on moral objections to how something is made, without clear scientific or health grounds, potentially opening the door to protectionism. He also touches on the difficulties of international agreements like the Kyoto Protocol, stemming from different views on who should bear the costs.
Okay, let's talk about corporations. Predatory or beneficial?
Again, a nuanced view. He acknowledges the risk of a race to the bottom and incentives poor countries offering too much to attract foreign direct investment, FDI.
Like giving away too many tax breaks.
Exactly. He also notes historical examples of multinationals meddling in politics, like ITT in Chile.
But on the other side, Wages.
He presents evidence suggesting multinationals often pay higher wages than comparable domestic firms, even controlling for other factors, though the premium might be smaller for workers in subcontracting firms.
What about working conditions, sweatshops?
He addresses the debate, citing the two cheers for sweatshops argument that while conditions might be harsh, they often represent a better alternative than what's otherwise available, and workers choose them voluntarily. He mentions the perspective of young women wanting to earn money quickly.
And enforcing labor standards like freedom of association?
He points out the difficulties, given varying national laws. Even the U.S. has laws like Taft-Hartley that restrict union activities, making it hard to impose a single global standard easily through trade rules.
What about corporations influencing the rules themselves? Lobbying?
That's a major concern he addresses. The possibility that multinationals lobby for international rules on trade, intellectual property, aid that benefit them, potentially at the expense of poorer countries.
The TRIPS agreement on intellectual property is a key example for him, isn't it?
Yes, he worries that pharmaceutical lobbying led to overly long patent protections and restricted access to cheaper generic medicines, especially for diseases primarily affecting the poor, like malaria, though also for global diseases like AIDS.
He also raises ethical questions about exporting bats.
Right, products deemed harmful domestically but exported anyway. He argues if something is banned at home for safety reasons, its export should probably be banned too.
And what about products that are fine in rich countries but harmful in poor ones due to context?
The classic example is baby formula. Fine if used correctly with clean water, but potentially dangerous in places lacking those conditions if aggressively marketed as superior to breastfeeding.
And corporations lobbied against marketing codes for that.
He highlights that lobbying, particularly involving the U.S. government opposing the WHO code. He also uses the example of U.S. tobacco companies using trade rules to challenge Thailand's restrictions on foreign cigarette advertising.
A clear clash between trade liberalization and public health.
A very stark example, yes.
So moving towards the end of the book, he looks at other dimensions, the Asian financial crisis.
Right. He questions simple explanations for that crisis and points towards premature, poorly managed financial liberalization opening up capital flows too quickly without safeguards as a key factor.
He also discusses crony capitalism.
Yes, the perception of cozy, potentially corrupt links between business and government. He notes it happens everywhere, not just Asia, and criticizes what he sees as a sometimes selective focus on it by international institutions. He even wrote an op-ed titled, "Friend in the United States, but a crony in Asia."
He seems quite critical of the push for rapid financial liberalization in the 90s.
Very much so. He suggests influence from the Wall Street Treasury complex, pushing for capital account convertibility maybe too quickly, without fully considering the risks for developing countries. He notes even the economist later conceded a role for capital controls sometimes.
And finally, migration, the movement of people.
A hugely complex dimension. He notes it's driven by more than just wages, with existing networks and communities playing a big role. He talks about demographic pressures in aging rich countries needing immigrants.
But also the brain drain problem for poor countries.
Yes, skilled people leaving for better opportunities abroad. He suggests a diaspora model, encouraging home countries to engage with their citizens abroad for mutual benefit, accepting dual loyalties. Managing illegal immigration remains a challenge, though. He points to the failures of employer sanctions and the political complexities. He concludes there's a real lack of international architecture for dealing with migration compared to trade or finance.
So, after diagnosing all this, what's his prescription? Appropriate governance.
Exactly. He sees economic globalization and the growth of civil society, NGOs, as parallel successes and argues we need to harness them together.
How can NGOs help with governance?
Domestically, they can empower marginalized groups, hold governments accountable. He mentions judicial activism in India, enforcing labor laws, spurred by NGO pressure.
And internationally.
Cooperation is key for global challenges like pandemics. He notes historical successes against diseases like smallpox and argues rich countries have a self-interest in helping tackle threats like AIDS or tropical diseases that can cross borders.
But he warns against powerful countries imposing their will.
Yes, the selfish hegemon problem. Like the U.S. pushing hard for key rules that benefit its industries but might harm access to medicines elsewhere. Interdependence can become dependence.
So how do we cope with the inevitable downsides of globalization?
His key idea here is shifting from trying to predict and prevent every negative outcome which he sees as futile, citing failed Indian central planning, towards building robust institutions and policies that kick in when problems arise.
Like adjustment assistance for workers who lose jobs due to trade.
Precisely. Recognizing that job losses from imports feel politically different than losses from domestic competition, so you need programs like retraining and unemployment support. He contrasts this with failures like the Ethiopian famine, where known solutions like price supports weren't implemented.
And aid agencies have a role here.
Yes, providing financial resources and technical help for poor countries to build these shock absorbers and manage the downsides of openness.
What about proactively accelerating social agendas, using globalization for good?
He mentions the power of moral pressure and scrutiny, how international attention via the press or organizations like the ILO can influence regimes like Myanmar's.
But he's cautious about using trade sanctions for social goals.
Very cautious. He distinguishes between potentially protectionist motives, using labor standards to block imports, and genuine altruism, questioning, for example, whether unions demanding standards abroad are equally keen on immigration.
He thinks trade bodies like the WTO aren't suited for complex social issues.
Generally, yes. He argues the ILO is the better forum for labor standards. He points to the limited capacity of the WTO and the tricky precedents involved.
So the better path is through domestic laws and courts, maybe influenced by international norms.
That seemed to be his preference. ILO conventions get translated into national law, monitored by NGOs, enforced potentially through judicial activism, citing things like the Bangalore Principles, where courts look at international human rights law.
And addressing the unemployment fears directly.
He reiterates the standard economic argument. Job losses in import-competing sectors are typically offset by gains in exporting sectors, leading to an overall production gain, even if individuals need help transitioning.
So wrapping up, Bhagwati's overall take is pretty positive, isn't it?
Generally optimistic, yes. He sees globalization as having huge potential, as a benign force for social progress if it's managed well with the right kind of governance.
The key is moving beyond simplistic slogans, either for or against, and really digging into the complexities.
Exactly. Engaging with the nuances, the evidence, the trade-offs.
We really hope that listening to this deep dive encourages you, the listener, to consider the arguments Bhagwati makes in Defense of Globalization as you navigate the ongoing debates we still hear today. And here's a final thought to leave you with. Bhagwati highlights this ongoing tension between national sovereignty, a country's right to make its own rules, and the undeniable need for international cooperation in our globalized world. Thinking about the challenges we face today, from climate change to pandemics to economic stability, where do you see the most pressing need for new forms of international cooperation, perhaps even new institutions, and what might those actually look like?
A big question to ponder.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.